It was one of those evenings when the air felt crisp and fresh, like autumn was on the cusp of taking over the last remnants of summer. I had just finished my walk around the block, the kind of routine I'd gotten used to in my years of living alone. My feet were tired, my mind a little foggy, but there was a simple contentment that came with those quiet moments, the ones that didn't demand much. The neighborhood was peaceful, a good mix of families and older folks like me. It had been like this for years. Or at least, that's what I thought. As I approached my porch, I noticed her door was open. It wasn't unusual for her to be out there. She had a way of keeping her space open to the world, even when the rest of us closed ours off for the evening. Her name was Claire, and she lived 2 houses down. I'd seen her around for years, but we never really exchanged more than pleasantries. She was friendly enough, always with a smile, but she kept to herself. That evening, though, something was different. As I walked up the steps to my porch, Claire came out onto hers, holding a small dish in her hand. I stopped, half expecting her to wave, maybe say hello, and then would go back to our usual routine of casual nods, but instead, she smiled and said, "Hey, do you have plans for dinner tonight?" I hadn't really thought about it. Most nights, I just grabbed whatever I could find in the fridge, nothing fancy. But there was something in her tone, something warm, inviting, that made me pause before answering. "No, not really," I said, trying to sound casual. "Why?" She held the dish out, a quizzical look on her face. "I made too much, and I figured you might be hungry." "It's just pasta, but I thought, well, if you don't mind, would you join me for dinner?" There it was. The invitation. The kind that didn't feel like an obligation, but like a gesture, a genuine one. I don't know why, but it felt like more than just a casual offer. Maybe it was the way she said it, or maybe it was the unspoken connection that had quietly developed between us over the years. Whatever it was, I felt a flicker of something, maybe curiosity, maybe something else, and before I could second guess myself, I found myself nodding, "Sure. I'd like that." Her face lit up, a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Great. I'll set the table. Come on over whenever you're ready." And just like that, I found myself heading next door for the first time in all these years, something I hadn't ever really thought about doing before. It wasn't that I didn't like her, it's just that there was always a kind of distance, a line you didn't cross with neighbors, at least not when you'd lived as quietly as I had. But tonight felt different. It felt like a change, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. As I walked over to her house, I took in the sight of her porch. She had a small, cozy setup, 2 chairs, a little table, plants that were well tended. The kind of place you could sit in the evening and forget about the world for a while. It was clear that Claire took pride in her space, a reflection of who she was, someone who valued comfort, maybe a little solitude, but also connection. I knocked on her door, and she opened it almost immediately, as though she'd been expecting me. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "I hope you like pasta." The kitchen smelled of garlic and fresh herbs, the kind of smells that make you feel like you're in a home and not just a house. The walls were painted in soft, muted tones, nothing flashy, but comfortable. The kind of place where you could sit down and immediately feel at ease. The kind of place where, after a while, you might even find yourself revealing parts of yourself you didn't know you were ready to share. I took a seat at the small dining table. Claire moved around the kitchen with a grace that made everything seem effortless. She was wearing an old sweater that looked like it had seen better days, but it suited her, warm and unpretentious. She set down the pasta, a simple dish, but it looked delicious. There was a salad on the side, lightly dressed with something that smelled of lemon and olive oil. The candles on the table were flickering, casting a soft glow that made the whole room feel like it was wrapped in a kind of comfortable intimacy. "So," Claire began as she sat down across from me, her gaze meeting mine with a steady, calm look, "how's life treating you these days?" I hadn't expected that question. Most people, when you've lived as long as I have, don't ask that anymore. It's a kind of unspoken rule, you don't talk about the deeper things. But Claire, in her quiet way, had a way of breaking through all of that. "Honestly," I said, after a brief pause, "it's been fine. Routine, you know. Nothing too exciting. Just, well, it is what it is." She nodded, taking a bite of her pasta, chewing thoughtfully. Yeah, I get that. Life has a way of settling into routines, doesn't it? I wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but there was something soothing about it. Something about the way she listened, really listened, without rushing to fill the silence. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, and it felt nice. Familiar, even. There was no pretense here, just two people sitting down for a meal, sharing a moment. I didn't feel pressure to say anything or be anything other than myself. As the night went on, I started to realize that I was enjoying myself in a way I hadn't expected. I hadn't planned on getting to know Claire better. In fact, I had always kept to myself, not really giving much thought to what my neighbors were doing. But there was something disarming about her, something that made me want to open up, to let go of the years of solitude I had wrapped myself in. By the time the plates were cleared away and we were sitting back in our chairs, sipping a glass of wine, I felt a shift in the air. A kind of connection had formed between us, something unspoken but understood. It wasn't just about the dinner or the company, it was about the quiet understanding that we were both here, together, in this moment. And as I sat there, listening to the soft hum of the night outside and the warmth of the candlelight flickering between us, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, I had stepped into something that had been waiting for me all along. The evening stretched on in a way that felt both timeless and fleeting, like one of those rare moments when you realize how much space there is to breathe in life, if only you allow yourself to do so. Claire had cleared away the plates, but the warmth of the meal still lingered in the room, both in the air and in our conversation. We weren't talking about anything particularly deep, but there was an intimacy to it, a comfort I hadn't expected. I sipped my wine slowly, feeling the soft burn of it settle in, and watched as Claire moved around her small kitchen. She seemed at ease, her movements fluid and unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world. Her home, too, felt that way, cozy but not cluttered, organized but never sterile. It felt lived in, comfortable, like it was built for exactly this kind of quiet companionship. So, she said, settling back down across from me, do you ever feel like you're just waiting for something to happen? Like, something big? I didn't answer right away. It was a good question, but one I wasn't sure how to answer. How could I explain that my life had been quiet, predictable, and that I had learned to appreciate it that way? That even though I'd had a few moments of excitement, I never really felt the need to chase anything after the years had gone by. I don't know, I said after a pause, carefully setting my glass down. I think maybe I used to feel that way. But now, I guess. I don't know if I'm waiting for anything. Things just happen when they do, you know. Claire smiled softly, her eyes not leaving mine. It wasn't a pitying smile, or one filled with judgment. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they understand, when they've been in that place themselves. I get that, she said, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. I used to think the same. But then, I don't know. I started to wonder if maybe we're all just waiting for the wrong thing. Like, what if the big moments aren't the ones we're always expecting? What if it's the small ones, the little things that catch us off guard, that end up changing us? I didn't respond right away, her words sinking in. There was truth to what she said. I had spent so much of my life thinking that the next big thing would come along and change everything, but maybe, like Claire said, it wasn't about waiting for something big at all. Maybe it was about recognizing the subtle moments, the ones that come and go, but leave you feeling different. I never thought about it that way, I said slowly, glancing down at my glass. Maybe I've been waiting for something that doesn't even exist. Claire let out a soft chuckle, and there was something about it that made me feel like I wasn't alone in that thought. It wasn't just me, then, who had spent so much time looking for meaning in things that didn't matter. I think a lot of people do, she said, her eyes softening as she met my gaze again. We get stuck thinking that happiness or change has to come in a certain package, a certain way. But it doesn't. It can come from anywhere, even from the most unexpected places. I thought about her words, about my own life, and how much time I'd spent letting it slip by without really questioning it. It wasn't that I had regrets, no, I didn't regret much. But there were moments, small pockets of time, where I wondered if I had been too rigid, too focused on routine. Had I missed something? So, I said, my voice quieter now, What about you? Have you found those moments? The ones that surprised you? Claire paused, her fingers tapping lightly against her wine glass as she thought for a moment. She looked out the window for a second, almost as though she were looking at something beyond the ordinary, something distant, something personal. I've had a few, she said finally, her voice steady but gentle. Some were painful. Some were beautiful. But what I've learned is that those moments don't always happen when you expect them to. They just show up. And when they do, you either embrace them or you let them slip away. Her words resonated deeply. It was as if she had just peeled back a layer of my own thoughts, revealing something I hadn't been fully aware of. Something I had been avoiding. And what about now? I asked, leaning forward slightly. Are you waiting for something? Or have you embraced it? Claire's smile returned, but this time, it wasn't as bright, it was thoughtful, almost a little melancholic. I don't know, she said softly. I think I'm still learning. Still figuring out what I'm waiting for, if anything. But I think I'm open to it now. Whatever it is. We fell into a comfortable silence after that. There was something about that moment that felt honest, like we were both acknowledging something deep without saying too much. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a grand revelation. But it was real. And it felt like it was something that we had shared, without needing to explain it further. The wine had been slowly disappearing from our glasses, and the candles flickered low, casting soft shadows on the walls. The evening had stretched out, and though I wasn't ready for it to end, I knew it would. These moments didn't last forever, but I also knew that this particular one would stay with me in some way, whether I understood it completely or not. Finally, Claire stood up from the table, breaking the silence. She seemed almost reluctant to do so, but it was time to wind down the evening. Well, I should probably let you get some rest, she said with a soft smile. But I'm glad you came over. Really? I'm glad too, I replied, standing up as well. I wasn't sure what to say next, so I simply nodded, offering her a small smile of my own. The weight of the conversation lingered in the air between us, like an unspoken understanding that, for once, we didn't need to fill with words. We walked to the door together, and as I stepped out onto the porch, I paused for a moment, looking back at her. Thanks again for dinner, Claire, I said, the words sounding more sincere than I had meant them to. But there was something in that moment, something about the night that made it feel important. She gave a quiet nod, her eyes meeting mine in a way that felt more intimate than I expected. Anytime, she said, her voice soft, yet firm. Take care of yourself. And with that, I stepped off her porch and into the cool night air, the sky above filled with stars that, for once, seemed to shine just a little brighter than usual. The days that followed were quiet, like they always were, but something in me had shifted. It wasn't dramatic or immediate, it was more like a slow change, the kind of thing you don't notice until you look back and realize you've been walking down a different path all along. Claire's invitation, her simple act of kindness, had opened a door I hadn't known was there. In the days after that dinner, I found myself thinking about it more often than I expected. I thought about the way we'd spoken, about the things we hadn't said, the things that had been understood between us without needing explanation. There had been something so unassuming about it, yet so profoundly human. Maybe that was what had drawn me in, the simplicity of it. No pretense, no expectations, just a quiet understanding that, for one evening, we didn't need to hide behind the walls we'd built. But what had changed the most, I realized, was my own perspective. I had spent so many years in my little bubble, thinking that I was fine, that I didn't need anything beyond my own routine. I had convinced myself that I was content, that I didn't need connection. But as I went about my days, doing the same old things, I started to realize how much I had been missing out on. I wasn't lonely, exactly, at least not in the way I used to think about loneliness. But there was a quiet emptiness, a subtle ache that came from never letting anyone in. From never sharing more than surface-level conversations, never truly allowing myself to be vulnerable. But with Claire, I had let that guard down, just a little. It was odd to admit it, but I began looking forward to seeing her when we passed each other on the street, to small conversations that never seemed rushed. There was something comforting in those exchanges, a kind of mutual respect that hadn't existed before. And though I hadn't expected anything to come of it, I started to feel a kind of warmth when I thought about her. It was something different than friendship, but not quite something else. Not yet, anyway. But I found myself hoping it could be. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I was invited again. This time, there was no dinner. No fancy meal or anything like that. Claire had just invited me over for coffee, saying she'd found a new blend she thought I'd like. At first, it felt simple enough. But as I stepped into her house again, I realized how much had changed in such a short time. It wasn't just about the coffee or the conversation anymore. It was about the fact that I was here, again. That she had extended that invitation to me, without hesitation. We sat down on her porch this time, the night air warm and thick with the scent of flowers from the garden. There was a comfort to the silence between us. Neither of us felt the need to fill it with meaningless chatter. We just existed there, side by side, enjoying the moment for what it was. "I've been thinking," Claire said, breaking the silence as she sipped her coffee. "About what we talked about that night." I looked over at her, unsure of where this was going, but willing to listen. "You were right," she continued, her voice softer than before. "About the moments. The little things. I think we're all just trying to make sense of it all. And sometimes, those moments that we don't expect, those are the ones that mean the most." I nodded, the words she'd spoken echoing back to me, as if they had planted a seed in my mind that was only now beginning to sprout. "It's funny," I said after a moment, "how something so simple can have such a big impact. How a small invitation, a quiet dinner, can make you see the world differently." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. I think we all have a tendency to forget that. We wait for something big to happen, but maybe, sometimes, we just need to notice the quiet things that are right in front of us. I thought about that for a while. It was something I had realized on my own, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. It wasn't the grand gestures or the major life events that shaped us. It was the moments in between, the ones we sometimes overlook, that made the biggest difference. We sat there for what felt like hours, just talking, not about anything important, but about everything that mattered. We talked about our lives, our pasts, the small victories and regrets that made us who we were. There was no pressure, no expectation. It was just two people sharing a connection, one that neither of us had asked for, but somehow needed. As the evening wore on, the stars began to appear, one by one, in the clear sky above us. The world around us felt distant, almost unreal, as if we were the only two people left in it. "I never expected this," I said, my voice a little quieter than usual. "I never expected to feel like this. Like there's something more than just going through the motions." Claire turned to me, her eyes steady but filled with something I couldn't quite place, understanding, maybe, or something more. "It's not about expecting it," she said softly. "It's about letting it happen. You can't force things, but you can be open to them." And I realized then that what we had, whatever it was, wasn't forced. It hadn't been a grand gesture, a dramatic moment, it was just a simple invitation, a dinner shared between neighbors. But it had opened something in both of us. Something neither of us had been expecting, but something we were both ready to embrace, in whatever form it might take. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. Like I was open to whatever came next. I stood up, stretching my legs, and turned to face Claire. "Well," I said, smiling, "I guess I should get going. But thanks again for everything. For the dinner, the coffee, for just being here." She stood too, and there was that quiet understanding between us once again. "Anytime," she said with a smile. "Take care of yourself." And as I walked back to my house that night, the world around me didn't feel quite as small or as predictable as it had before. It felt fuller. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the moments I was waiting for were already here. I just needed to open my eyes and see them.